Mrs. Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us topic 8.9, which is now all about solid waste disposal. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit in Unit 8, and we're going to move a little bit away from mainly water pollution, and now we're going to start talking about terrestrial or land pollution. So with that being said, how do we then dispose of the solid waste that we may generate on land? Any waste is going to be any material output from a system that's not useful or wind up being consumed. Through municipal solid waste, any refuse, so that's really any waste collected by any municipalities, towns, villages, cities, and so on, from households, small businesses, right, wind up in this one kind of like waste stream. So this is the flow of whatever solid waste we may generate, whether that be to a landfill, to a recycling center, to maybe to be incinerated. It can wind up in a multitude of different directions. Now, the reason why we need to pay close attention to how much solid waste we tend to generate is because we've only seen the generation of municipal solid waste increase through the years, not only in total, but also per person or per capita. Now, what type of solid waste is disposed of and what type of solid waste can actually be recovered? Well, when we look at the composition by weight of the municipal solid waste, especially in the United States prior to any recycling happening, a lot of the waste that's generated can come from around three things. That'd be paper, food, and yard waste. The breakdown of those materials and recovering of those materials, such as like paper, can actually wind up being recycled. It can be recovered. Food and yard waste, however, is usually going to be discarded in a landfill, unfortunately. Now, another form of waste that you might not think about very often, but with the introduction of technology and more introduction of technology across the globe, what do we do with those forms of technology that outlive their lifespan? Any form of technology such as that is usually known as e-waste or electronic waste. So that can be things like old televisions, computers, iPads, old cell phones, and so on. That can also wind up in our municipal solid waste stream. But what large problem stems from e-waste is the fact that a lot of the materials that help to build those electronics can wind up leaching toxic metals like mercury and cadmium into a landfill if that's where they are disposed of. Mercury, cadmium are endocrine disruptors, and so they can wind up in those facilities, maybe if they happen to contaminate the water near the landfill. Wildlife can be exposed to those, and maybe even human contact too. Now, the only thing though with e-waste, usually a lot of our e-waste isn't necessarily kept in the United States. We unfortunately tend to ship a lot of it to more developing countries that take them apart, and unfortunately those populations tend to be exposed to the endocrine disruptors from that e-waste rather than us. So then, where does most of our waste go, especially if it can't be recovered or if it can't be recycled? It's usually going to wind up in what's known as a landfill, specifically a sanitary landfill. This is going to be an engineered ground facility designed to hold the municipal solid waste with as little contamination to the outside environment as possible. So it is going to be built to try and prevent leachate. That's going to be liquid that can contain elevated levels of pollutants that stem from the municipal solid waste held within the landfill itself. We may also see a tipping fee. This is a fee charged for disposing of material in the landfill or incinerator. That can happen to folks like near or around the landfill as well. So what are some of the components of a sanitary landfill? I would certainly star this in your notes. This is something that I've seen come up in multiple choice questions and in the FRQ questions. Now, looking at the very base of our sanitary landfill, typically that's going to be lined with either a clay or plastic liner, because if you think back to Unit 4, when we talk about the different types of soils, remember clay is not very permeable, right? It is very, very small in size, so it compacts really well. So a clay liner is actually going to help to prevent any leachate, right? Any pollutants leaking out into the soil or groundwater, because it's not permeable. You'll also find that they will have a system of tubes or pipes. Those are going to be built to collect any leachate. So remember, leachate's going to be collections of liquids that contain high levels of pollutants that stem from the solid waste. We can also have a system of tubes and pipes. These tubes and pipes will collect methane. Because remember, if we have all of this organic waste, especially food waste, yard waste, that is going to be broken down by decomposers. When anaerobic decomposition takes place, that can release tremendous amounts of methane, which we know is a greenhouse gas. But that methane can then be captured at the landfill and can actually wind up being used to generate electricity or maybe heat buildings nearby. And then what we'll also find too, not only will they have a clay or plastic bottom, but they can even have a clay cap. So this is a clay soil mixture used to cover the landfill. Once it's full, this can kind of help to keep any animals out, keep the smell in, and it potentially allows for some vegetation to regrow on top of the landfill. So what does that look like? Well, we might find, right, that solid waste is going to be transported to a landfill. That waste is going to be compacted, usually by a specialized form of machine. Remember, we said before they're going to have a system of tubes and pipes that are going to collect any leachate. And notice that those systems of tubes and pipes come prior to whatever groundwater is trapped underneath the rock of the sanitary landfill. Here is our clay liner. Right, that is to kind of help any other contamination that could take place. And here's our system of methane extraction. So here's where we can see tubes, pipes, collecting any methane given off by any decomposers that are breaking down any of the organic waste. And eventually, over time, if this landfill becomes filled, we can then cap it with a mixture of clay and soil. So now, what should then technically be disposed of in a landfill, especially if it has the potential to contaminate things like groundwater and soil? So landfills generally have very low rates of decomposition because there is low availability of oxygen, moisture, and organic material combination to make it ideal. Since these three factors are rarely present all together, decomposition can happen quite slowly, so landfills can wind up filling up really, really quickly. So we need to be mindful of what we place in a landfill. So some things that should never go in a landfill would be any form of hazardous waste, antifreeze, motor oil, cleaners, right, our e-waste that we talked about before, things like copper, aluminum, those items should be recycled rather than disposed of. Things like old tires should technically not be in a landfill because they can perpetuate mosquito breeding. Especially if it rains, it creates a way for standing water to accumulate, and then that's where just mosquitoes are going to continue to breed and potentially spread disease. Things that can be landfilled, so these are things that could potentially become decomposed in the landfill over time. That would be cardboard, food wrappers that maybe don't have as much food residue in them that can't necessarily be recycled, rubber, plastic film, styrofoam, food or yard waste, paper can go in a landfill, but they can also be recycled or even composted in the home as well. So what are some of the issues associated with landfill use? Landfills can have impacts on groundwater, and they can also release greenhouse gases. Those would be the two big ones. Groundwater contamination can occur with heavy metals like lead and mercury, even acids, medications, bacteria, right? Really, it depends on what's being disposed of in the landfill is what the contamination may wind up being. Now, the EPA estimates that about virtually all landfills in the United States have had some form of leaching into groundwater. So this is something that we are continuing trying to improve upon. Greenhouse gases like methane, carbon dioxide are going to be released from landfills due to the decomposition that takes place, and we know that both of those can contribute to global warming and climate change. And then something else that you may not think about in terms of landfills that's not really environmental based, this is more like economic based, but we can have sightings. This is a designation of a landfill location. Usually, these sightings have been a source of environmental injustice because a lot of people with financial resources or potential influence can kind of have that mentality that, well, they don't want to have a landfill in their town, so let's put it someplace else where people really aren't going to be able to afford to say no. And so oftentimes landfills wind up going into areas that are of poverty because no one else can fight for the landfill to not be there, unfortunately. Now, what are some alternative methods to disposing in a landfill? Now, we can also incinerate waste that is disposed of. We can use incineration in order to reduce the volume of trash generated and disposed of in a landfill. Right, so we can wind up, burning things like paper, food, and so on. In that incinerator, it's going to release air pollutants because that is a form of incomplete combustion, especially with plastics and metals. The incinerator will produce most likely ash that's going to be concentrated and may even be toxic as well. So that ash is actually going to have to wind up probably being disposed of in a more specialized landfill specifically for toxic materials. And then another form of incineration is known as waste to energy. So this is a system in where the heat generation by the incineration is actually used as the energy source for the building itself. Now, rather than just in the United States, where might people put their trash other than a landfill? Right? Because usually sanitary landfills are ways in which more developed nations tend to dispose of their municipal solid waste. So what about areas that may or may not have those same legislations, right? Same governmental regulations. So unfortunately, that means our oceans unfortunately have served as large dumping grounds for a lot of trash generated over the years. And that is where the area known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch kind of comes into play. This is unfortunately, collection of a lot of solid waste that's been dumped into waters, and it winds up actually concentrating and rotating around in currents in the Pacific Ocean. It varies in size depending upon the time of year. Sometimes it can get up to the size of Texas, and usually this is a result of illegal ocean dumping that tends to happen in areas that don't have very many environmental regulations. And the other unfortunate part about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is this plastic tends to kind of float around in the ocean, and animals sometimes believe it to be food, and so they ingest it. It can cause them to suffocate, it can entangle them, and it can wind up leading to death for a lot of aquatic or marine species that live nearby. All right, so that brings us to the practice FRQ for 8.9. If you want to take a moment and write this in your FRQ journal and on the Edpuzzle. Here it states, trash incineration is one way to generate electricity from municipal solid waste. Electricity can also be generated from waste buried in landfills. Describe the specific steps of a process used to produce electricity from waste buried in a landfill. Many landfills do not accept used tires. As a result, the tires are often dumped in poorly regulated piles. Describe one human health problem associated with piles of discarded tires. So, some of the accepted answers here, guys. In the first one, right where it says describe specific steps of a process used to produce electricity from waste, remember we mentioned that landfills, due to decomposition, can produce tremendous amounts of methane, which we know is a greenhouse gas. To obtain that methane fuel, this can be done through a system of collection pipes. That fuel will then be combusted, right, to heat up water, turn that water into steam. That steam is produced and then is used to turn a turbine to generate electricity. So a little throwback to Unit 6. And then looking at tires, a human health associated with the discarded tires. This could be the fact that tires, we said, provides a habitat for mosquitoes, for pests, because of that standing water. Those mosquitoes can be vectors or transmitters of disease for humans. Or even the tires could catch fire within the landfill. Those tires can then release toxic air pollutants that cause respiratory issues in humans. All right, everyone, that's it for our video on 8.9. If you have any questions, please leave it at the end of the video.